All right. So before we get going here today, let's do some kind of moving forward. That Canvas discussion is due by the end of the day on Monday. All right. We also have that Module 7 reading was due before we started class today. We've got those old module quizzes. So the one that'll be due before we start class on Monday is the July 9th quiz. It's always 2 days after we go through it live in class. So because it goes over the weekend, that won't be until before class starts on Monday. I'll have a daily quiz today. That won't be due until we start class on Tuesday. I also, after class, you can see it up here already. This will be set to release, so you can do the Module 8 reading. We'll start Module 8 on Monday, but to line up with the syllabus, I kind of have that due date set just to be before we start class on Tuesday. So that's kind of everything we have kind of moving forward. I will also post another Canvas discussion on Monday. That won't be due until the following week. So after our next midterm, I'll mention a little bit more about that at the end of class. But just kind of making you aware that Canvas discussion will pop up, but it won't be due until after the exam. So if you want to do it early, you can. If you want to wait and focus on it until after the exam, you'll have a few days to do that as well. So I'll have that set to be due that Tuesday after the exam. Today we'll primarily be just working through, Module 7. So we've got this Excel file in our slides. We probably won't have quite enough time to get through it all. What we don't get through, we'll start with on Monday and then kind of jump right into Module 8 pretty quickly on Monday. So that's kind of where we're at. Are there any questions before we jump into material here?
Is Module 8 our last module before the midterm?
Yep. So it'll be 5, 6, 7, and 8.
Okay.
Yep. Oh, and I failed to mention, quiz 3, right? That's going to be due by the end of the day Monday as well. I'll get up the final quiz um, after class on Tuesday because we'll have covered all the material. I'll have that set to be due before um, the exam starts. Now, obviously, I would try to do it well in advance of that, but you'll kind of have that Tuesday after class and then have Wednesday and Thursday really to complete that. So I've got those practice problems up for quiz 3. I'll post to this main homepage the practice problems for quiz 4 as well. So, now that we've gotten through module 6 or 7 after today, you can kind of start working on those. And then module 8, those kind of questions will start going through next week. Okay. Any other questions before we get going? Okay. So we left off kind of thinking about we have a consumption function, which tells us how much people are consuming given whatever their current level of disposable income is. We had this constant and we had kind of the slope, which we called that marginal propensity to consume. So we said individuals have a certain amount of income. They don't spend all of it, they'll save some of it. So even though I have $100, maybe I only purchase $80 worth of goods. So we'll first kind of start out today thinking about this through a single consumer's lens. We'll then kind of advance to thinking about, okay, what if, we've got 100 consumers in our economy? How would this apply? So we talked about, we could calculate average propensity to consume, marginal propensity to consume. We should always have that the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save add up to one. We're either spending or we're saving our money. Okay. So with this idea in mind, and I will kind of talk about what this constant was here in just a second. We said if I were to put these on a graph, right? If every single dollar that I earned, I was spending. So my marginal propensity to consume was essentially one. This would be that the actual level of consumption, the actual level of disposable income. So this is going to be my disposable income. Here's going to be consumption on the y-axis. Those would be exactly the same. Right? Now, or sorry, those are going to be exactly the same if I'm spending all of my disposable income. Now, my actual consumption may vary from this, right? So there's going to be a difference between these 2 points. When they're exactly equal to each other, every dollar I have, I'm spending. We would kind of think about this as like my equilibrium level of consumption. Now, part of what's dictating why there's a difference here is because even if I have zero disposable income, right? I don't have any money here. I'm still going to need to buy housing, food, something to stay alive. So what might I do? Take out loans, in which case my spending is well above what my income is, and I'm having like dis savings, right? So I think maybe a clear graph of this is going to be right here. So we said this is when my actual consumption is the same as my disposable income. Here's what, sorry, this is if my consumption was equal to my disposable income, but my actual consumption is going to be represented by this red line. So anytime my actual consumption is below what I could be spending, I must be saving. Anytime my actual consumption is above what I'm currently earning, I must be dis-saving, right? Or I must be kind of in debt. The point where they're equal to each other, we would call this our break-even income, right? Or this break-even level of consumption. It's when every dollar I'm earning, I'm spending. I'm not saving anything, but I'm also not in debt. Okay? So I'll return to kind of this visual as we work through some examples, but that's kind of where we left off. So what tells us the actual level of consumption? This kind of black line here is like if I was spending every dollar that I have, but we know people don't do that, right? So what is my actual level of consumption? It's going to be dictated by this consumption function we have. We said the slope is my marginal propensity to consume, or what portion of my disposable income that I'm spending. And then we have some level that even if this was equal to zero, even if I have no income, I need to take out loans to buy food and housing, right? This is my autonomous consumption, we'll call it. Okay. So what would my break-even level of actual consumption be? How would I solve this, right? So this is going to be an easier form. We'll kind of complicate this here in a second. Excuse me, but let's assume that this was the consumption function that we had, right? Now I'll write this out in more general terms. So what did 0.8 represent? That was our marginal propensity to consume, or the proportion of our income that we were spending on products. We then had this autonomous consumption. That was how much we're spending, even if disposable income was equal to zero. Now, just as a reminder, some things I could do in questions you might see pop up on the quiz or in the practice problems or on the exam is I might not tell you what this marginal propensity to consume is, but if I tell you what the marginal propensity to save is, well, how would I calculate my marginal propensity to consume? My marginal propensity to consume and save added up should always be equal to 1. So if I know my marginal propensity to save, I know that my marginal propensity to, oops, sorry, and leave myself a lot of room. I would know that my marginal propensity to consume would be 1 minus my marginal propensity to save. So here, if I told you the marginal propensity to save is 0.2, you know that marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. So how do I find this break-even level of disposable income where all of my money would be spent on consumption? I have no savings, I have no dis-savings. Well, essentially, if that's the case, these two things are exactly the same. So I could almost think about it here like, what's the level of disposable income or what's the level of consumption where I'd be spending everything? I would just kind of make these, I know that these two would be equal, right? C is equal to YD, if that was the case. So I go through and solve this, right? I would subtract 0.8 times C from both sides. I have C here, so I can kind of pull this out front. I divide both sides by 1 minus 0.8, and I get that that break-even level of consumption is equal to 0.7 over 0.2, or what, 3.5? Okay. Now, if I didn't have the values, I can always kind of, put this in more general terms by doing the same thing over here, right? So I'll show you it doesn't really matter how we kind of notate this. Like either I'm looking for the break-even consumption or the break-even level of disposable income. Those should be the same. So let's say instead I call this YD. I just know these are the same. If I have no savings and positive or negative, it's exactly equal to 0. So I could do Subtract this from both sides. Pull this out front. And I get that that break-even level must be whatever my autonomous consumption is divided by 1 minus my marginal propensity to consume. Once again, if I just plugged in 0.7, 0.8, I'm getting the exact same value here. Okay. So that's how I can find my break-even level of consumption. Right? I could also do something like the following. Okay. So let's assume I have the same setup, and this is in the slides, but let's instead of finding the break-even level, let's say I tell you that disposable income is not 3.5, but it's currently 2.4. Well, if I want to know what the current level of consumption is, I've got my consumption function. All I'm doing is plugging this in. So here I'd have what? 2.4. This is where I should have a little calculator pulled up here so I make sure I'm not making any egregious errors in my head by doing this math. So if I put this into my calculator, I end up with what? So I've got what? 2.4 times 0.8 plus 0.7. I get 2.62. So that's my current level of consumption, right? What are my savings? Well, if I'm currently spending this much, but my original income was only 2.4, you can think about savings is going to be what my actual income is minus how much I'm spending or minus my consumption. So here I would have 2.4 minus 2.62, or the level of savings I have, it's actually negative, right? I'm in debt, okay? So giving you a hypothetical disposable income, you could then calculate consumption to know what the level of savings is. You would just look for the difference between that consumption and what your original disposable income was. Okay. Any questions on that before I kind of add another thing in here? So with this idea in mind, we know the break-even point was 3.5, and I then gave you this hypothetical point of 2.4, which led to that they were actually in debt, right? Or negative savings. So we could actually put this into the visual that we had earlier, right? So before we said, if I have my level of disposable income and then what my consumption is, if those are exactly the same, this is when individuals are spending every dollar they earn, or like a marginal propensity to consume of one. Okay? And they haven't taken out any loans for autonomous consumption. We know that actual consumption will start out wherever autonomous consumption is, but then it's not one-to-one because our marginal propensity to consume, we don't spend every single dollar that we make. So my actual consumption would look something like this. When we were looking at this break-even point, that's where my actual consumption equaled my disposable income, or our savings were 0. That was that 3.5 value we found before. Now, when I gave you that hypothetical value of 2.4, you couldn't necessarily tell me the values without doing the actual calculation. But if I asked you, is savings positive or negative here? Well, if I'm below the break-even point, I know that the level of my disposable income is below my actual consumption. So if the amount of money I'm making, right, minus the actual amount I'm spending, well, that should be equal to my savings. In which case, if the amount of income I'm making is ever less than consumption, I know that savings is less than 0. So any point below that break-even level of disposable income, I know in this range we said we have dissavings or negative savings. If instead I was looking at a point up here, so maybe I told you assume that the disposable income is 5.2. Well, if I'm above the break-even point, now I know that that kind of point of consumption, if I was spending all of my money relative, um, sorry, the amount of money that I have, 5.2, relative to the amount that I'm actually consuming. Well, once again, savings is that amount of income I have minus what I'm consuming. If the amount of income I have is greater than consumption, well, now I know that that difference is greater than zero, or I have a positive amount of savings. So if you find the break-even point, you know any point above that, you've got positive values of savings. Any point or any disposable income below that, I'm actually going to have negative savings. Okay. And then we went through the example. If I gave you a hypothetical amount, you not only can tell me if there's savings or dissavings. Well, if I can put this out, right? Oh. If I give you this actual hypothetical value, you could calculate what that level of savings or dissavings actually was. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Excuse me. Okay. So what if we complicate this a little bit? Right. So this idea of break-even income or consumption, this was like through the lens of one consumer, but really, when it comes to the entire economy, if every consumer faces a similar of being amount that's being consumed would be how much is each individual consuming, and then add them all up, right? For every single individual that we have in our economy. So we can think about that actual level of kind of disposable income or real GDP, right? That was, we could call that disposable income of like every person in our economy. Now, the way that we calculated GDP using the expenditure approach, it was C plus I plus G plus net exports, NX. Right? So how would I find my break-even level of consumption in an economy, or what would my break-even equilibrium level of GDP be, where everything that's being produced is exactly the same as everything that's being purchased? All right, or my expenditures equal output? Well, I would take my consumption function, I'd plug it in here, and then that break-even point would be where the disposable income of the representative consumer is, or the kind of overall level of disposable income across all of my consumers is the same as my real GDP here. So if I gave you an example where I have these different values, how would I then solve for this equilibrium level of consumption in the entire economy, or the equilibrium level of output or GDP? Okay. Now, for right now, I'm going to assume no taxes. I'll show you we have to talk about taxes and how that would influence here in a second, but we're going to kind of work through this together. Okay. So we now not just have don't just have our consumption function. We've now got kind of our overall level of GDP is going to be equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports. Our consumption function was um, 0.8 times our disposable income plus zero point 0.7 here. We were told investments were 1.5. We were told government spending is 2.4, and net exports was negative 0.3. So this would be how do we find net exports? Just to kind of recall this, we'll use this later on today. It's exports minus imports. So what must be the case here? My imports were larger than my exports. But in terms of finding this break-even level of GDP now, right, not one individual's income, but the overall level in our economy, all we're doing is a math equation, right? So I'll kind of do the math here and then I'll show you what this looks like in more general terms, but it's a very similar idea. So I would subtract 0.8 times YD from both sides. I'm then left with this. I add all these up, I get what? 3.9, 3.6, 4.3, if I'm doing math in my head correct. I'm going to pull that YD out front. Now that break-even level of GDP is 4.3 over 1 minus 0.8. Okay. So if I get that entered in my calculator here, got what? 4.3 divided by zero point 0.2 or 21.5. Okay. Any questions on that before I add something in here?
I'm a little confused on like how you're getting zero point 0.8 times YD and then making it into 1 minus zero point 0.8.
Right here.
Yeah.
So if I have something that I'm basically just um so I could think of this as 1 times YD minus zero point 0.8 times YD. If they have a similar factor, then it's really like I'm multiplying this by
Uh,
1 and then multiplying it by zero point 0.8.
okay. Yeah, I see that.
Okay. Now, I was using values here, but if I go back to what did these represent? Well, over here, what I had was YD times 1 minus, what did zero point 0.8 represent? My marginal propensity to consume. What did I have left once I subtracted that? I had my autonomous consumption. I had investment, government spending, and net exports. Right? That's what all these values represented. So to then get that break-even level, we divided both sides by 1 minus MPC, right? So that break-even level, I can solve for it if I have the values, but in general, it's going to be my autonomous spending plus investments plus government expenditures plus net exports all divided by 1 minus my marginal propensity to consume. It's just we had the values that we were plugging in there. Okay. Now, once again, I could tell you the marginal propensity to save. So let's say in this case, I told you the marginal propensity to save was 0.3. Well, what it was my marginal propensity to consume? We know these always have to add up to 1, so my marginal propensity to consume here would be 0.7. Now, I could also, instead of figuring that out, what is 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume? That would have to be, well, if I'm not consuming something, I'm saving it. So I really could just plug in 0.3 here and I get the same thing. So whether or not I divide by 1 minus my marginal propensity to consume or I divide by my marginal propensity to save, I would be getting the same value here. So it just matters kind of which one you're given in the question. Okay. Any other questions on this before we make it a little more complicated? Okay. So what if instead I had an example where I've got taxes, right? So you have the same setup. It's just that now, I need to, there we go. It's just that now, when I'm solving, I don't have just my regular consumption because the amount of disposable income I have, well, if I'm making $100, but I have to pay 20 in taxes, the amount of money I'm left over to buy products with would be just 80. So when we think about disposable income, it's the amount of income that I'm earning minus taxes, right? So here, when I'm thinking about disposable income, I'm now going to factor in these taxes I have to pay, which here I'm just going to make them 0.8. Okay. So what would change in this equation? Right? So we'll kind of work through it here. So I'm going to have the same values, but I'm now going to add in taxes. Right? So all I'd be doing is thinking about, and I'll do this one in red so we can kind of see this as my tax example. So now I've got my level of GDP would be consumption, but my consumption function is zero point 0.8 times, well, what is my disposable income? It's my actual income minus my taxes, right? So instead of just having a disposable income here, I have to actually calculate it before these were the same. I was paying no taxes. Now they vary, right? I would then have my autonomous consumption still in there. I would have investments, government spending, net exports. So it's going to be a very similar, like I'm solving for this in a very similar way, right? It's just that now when I kind of rearrange this, so now I'm saying, what's that break even point? Or where is the total amount of money that an individual is earning is the same as the amount that's being spent or consumed. So I could think about these are the same value. I could kind of think about it like this is instead y now. They're just going to be the same. So I'm going to notate them with the same kind of variable. So if I subtract this from both sides, what am I left with? 0.8 negative zero point 0.8 times my taxes. And then all these values will still be the same. So we're going to have kind of a similar thing, right? I can rewrite this. I can divide both sides by 1 minus zero point 0.8, and I get that that break-even point would be this, right? So it's just, at this point, it's just math because I was told taxes are also zero point 0.8. It's just a matter of getting this entered into my calculator, okay? So if I do that, I've got what? I've got all the same equations, but I'm now subtracting that marginal propensity to consume times the value of taxes. I should get 18.3. Okay. So when I factor in taxes, I'm going to find a different break-even point than I did before. Okay. Now, if I was writing this out in more general terms, I'm going to have the exact same equation that I did before. So this kind of break-even amount of income, right here I was kind of thinking about it just as Y, right, was my autonomous consumption plus my investments plus my government spending plus my net exports. But now I'm subtracting what was that original 0.8? That was my marginal propensity to consume times taxes. Now, usually I would just kind of write tax in here as T, but I want to kind of make sure we know that this is the component of taxes and then over 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. So it's very similar to what we did before. It's just now we're kind of factoring in taxes as well. And this kind of makes sense. If I'm having to pay taxes, then the break-even level, the amount of money I have left over even to spend is going to be lower. So that break-even point is lower than it was before. Okay. And when we go through the daily quiz today, we'll kind of revisit taxes here. But for now, this is kind of where we will leave things. Okay.
I kind of had one question from the textbook about taxes.
Yep.
And this is kind of just in the question, it kind of prompts you it like when you're calculating, it says government spending equal to taxation. And I was just wondering if that's something that will always happen, if government spending will equal taxation, or if that's just something that was in that specific question.
So here we're thinking about um, how are taxes going to influence consumption. So when we said there's government expenditures, before what we were assuming is that whatever consumers were paying in taxes, we were spending exactly all of it from the government. But here, depending on the level of taxes, that's also going to change my consumption because it's influenced by my marginal propensity to consume.
Mhm.
Right? So it's a little bit different than the older model that we were looking at because we are kind of complicating it now. Um, that a change in the tax level, yes, it would increase government revenue that we have possible to spend, but it's also going to influence now our kind of consumer behavior, right? Because before we were assuming that every dollar someone made, they were spending. Now we're factoring in that they're not, right? That marginal propensity to consume might vary or it might differ from the actual kind of potential level of consumption, right? That's what we're solving for with this break-even point. When we have savings or dissavings, the actual level of consumption is not really the potential level of consumption. Before, we were just thinking about without tax, when we weren't factoring in taxes on consumers, every dollar being earned was being spent. We now don't have that being the case. We have savings or savings. We're looking for what point would be where we kind of break even.
Okay,
Is
got it.
that
Yeah, that helps clear
okay?
it up. Thank you.
So that's what things look like with taxes here. Um, what I then want to do is stop this share, but for some reason, okay, you should be able to see my slides now, right? So we went through this example. Um, we'll talk about things that kind of shift consumption or things that might shift investment. So I'll kind of hold off on this for a second and let's jump into that Excel file. So we'll go to this equilibrium GDP tab. We're then going to blow this up so we can see things. Whoops. There we go. So we'll gloss over this one for right now. These are just different values from the kind of problem that we just worked through. I think I had, these slightly different. We can come back to this next class if we have time. It's really the same thing, just different values from what we had today. I'll use some different values though to kind of start out to make this next comparison. So let's say we start out and we have, and to kind of make this a little bit more clear, when I say C here, this is actually the autonomous consumption, right? So this is the part of consumption that is constant, right? Regardless of my marginal propensity to consume. So the way that we solve for that break-even point is we said what was in our numerator. It was the autonomous consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, but then we subtracted out the level of taxes times that marginal propensity to consume. Okay. So that was our numerator, and then we divided that all by 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. So this is just the equation that I was just showing you. Right? I've just got cell references instead of actually writing in kind of that notation. That's what all these represent. So this is how we solve for an equilibrium level of real GDP. We have initially, it starts out at 4,525. Let's assume that investments increase. So everything else stays the same, but my investments are going up by 200, right? From 6 to 800. Little typo there, GDP. Well, I would use the exact same equation I have up here, but my investments are now going to be 800 instead of 600. So initially you might think, okay, investments went up by 200, my GDP will go up by 200 as well. But that's not quite the case, right? And so the reason why is because, if I can get my mouse to, there we go. When I'm seeing investment go up here, it's not, if this was a change of 200, well, it's not getting divided by 1. It's getting divided by 1 minus, in our case, was like zero 0.8. So 200 divided by something that's less than 1 is going to be an even larger increase in my real GDP. Right? So that same $200 investment, it won't cause my real GDP break even equilibrium GDP to go up by 200. Instead, it would go up by 200 over 1 minus zero 0.8 or 200 over 0.2. So when we make this actual calculation, from that increase in investment of $200, my new GDP would be 5,525. That change was actually 1,000, right? So I'm getting like a 5 times larger increase in real GDP than that initial increase in investment. And that's because we have this kind of marginal propensity to consume as part of that equation of our break-even point, right? Any questions on that idea? Okay. Um, Another thing I wanted to kind of make the point here was what's going to happen. So if I have this equation, and for right now, we can even think about, let's assume we have this tax example, but I'll kind of think about just the change or what would happen if we didn't have taxes, and then adding them in, it would kind of be the same idea. So let's say I've got no taxes here. This is how we were solving for our break even, our equilibrium level of GDP, where everything being earned is being consumed. Well, if my marginal propensity to consume goes up, so this would like be going from 0.8 to 0.9. Well, if I'm subtracting a larger value, that's driving my denominator to be lower. If my denominator is lower, this fraction is actually going to go up. So at higher marginal propensities to consume, holding everything else constant, that break-even level of GDP is actually going to be higher than it was before. So if we kind of go to our Excel file, we can prove this to ourselves. So let's say everything remained the same, right? So here we'll kind of start out with this scenario. If my marginal propensity to consume is instead 0.9 instead of 0.8, we said this new equilibrium level of GDP should be higher than it was before, right? When it was 0.8, it was only 4,500. When it's 0.9, it's much higher. Okay. And don't pay attention to this for right now because we haven't changed the marginal propensity to consume in the other categories. I was just kind of using this to kind of prove that point. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. Mm, Let me think how I want to go through this in order. Um, we'll go through the daily quiz now, and then we'll kind of come back to the next topic. So let's go to this July 10th quiz. So this will kind of lead us into something that we'll talk about next class. Well, yeah, we'll do this now. Going through things a little bit different than what I did in my other section, but I think that's okay. So look at this daily quiz. We've got two problems. The first one really shouldn't be too bad. It's going to go way back to when we first started this discussion of finding break-even levels of consumption, even before we got to like thinking about this as GDP. So here I've got, we can work through this. So if I gave you a marginal propensity to save, I told you what the kind of current autonomous spending or consumption level was, what would be the break-even real GDP? So I didn't give you the actual function, but I'm giving you the components of that function. So we said before, consumption is going to be equal to our marginal propensity to consume times our disposable income plus this autonomous consumption or autonomous spending. So we're going to have an example here where we don't have taxes, right? I told you autonomous consumption or spending was 900. I told you the marginal propensity to save was 0.16. Okay. Well, I need my marginal propensity to consume. So my marginal propensity to consume would be 1 minus my marginal propensity to save, or what? 0.84 here. Okay. Now we said when we kind of rearrange this equation, we could plug our values in here, or I could just do this in general terms. So subtract this from both sides. But we said we're looking for the break-even point. So it's when these two things are the same. So I could really kind of rewrite this as what level of disposable income and consumption would lead to zero savings. I pull this out front. I divide both sides by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. And I get this break-even level of income, or what we eventually kind of said we could take one consumer um, not magnify it, but kind of convert it to the entire economy by how many people that we have in our economy that are these representative consumers. And now it's just a matter of plugging in my values. So I'd have what, 900 over 0.16. That should give me 5,000 something. Let me use my calculator here. So 900 divided by 0.16, 5,625. All right. Okay. Now you'll notice 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Well, what would that be equal to? Also my marginal propensity to save. So it ends up being the same value there. Okay. Just different ways of kind of approaching this. Any questions on that one before we move to question 2 here? Okay. So question 2 is something we haven't quite talked about yet, but we have all the components that we would need. So I'm kind of leading us into what we'll probably start out with in class on Monday. But let's say I have a change in government spending. Now, we already saw that like a change in investment of 200 led to a change in real GDP that was even larger than that. I think the example we had was it increased GDP by 1,000, or this break-even equilibrium level of GDP by 1,000. So if I have an increase in government spending, we could even think about here a $1 increase. What impact would that have on real GDP relative to a $1 increase, or sorry, decrease in taxes? So let's go back to the general form of our equation when we were solving for this break-even level of GDP, or kind of disposable income here. We had that was going to be our autonomous consumption plus investments, government spending. Here I'll kind of break this down. Plus exports minus imports. Remember that difference is our net exports. But then we were subtracting our marginal propensity to consume times taxes. And then all of that was divided by 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. Okay. So before we get too far, let's think about when I'm thinking about how much a change in government spending will change this break-even point, I'm really thinking about a derivative, right? How much is this break-even point going to be changing by when I see a 1 unit or $1 increase in government spending? Well, basically, none of this matters, right? If I'm seeing just a $1 change in government spending, I'd be taking a derivative in respect to this, which really would be, I can think about it this way, it's like G times 1 over 1 minus MPC. So a derivative in respect to G here would just leave me with this. This is the change in real GDP from a $1 change in government spending. So just to use a hypothetical value, if my marginal propensity to consume was 0.8, this would be what? 1 over 1 minus 0.8 or 5. For every dollar spent on government by the government, it's increasing that break-even equilibrium level of GDP by 5. Okay. This was similar to our other examples. So instead of, if we increase government spending by 200, it caused real GDP to go up by 1,000. Okay. What if instead I want to know that same $1, what if it was coming from a change in taxes? Well, if I look at the tax over here, nothing else is changing but just tax. I'd actually have what? Negative MPC over 1 minus MPC times tax. So if I take a derivative in respect to tax, what I'm left with is this. Okay. Now here, the change is negative, right? When taxes go up, there's less expenditures in the economy. People have less money to spend. And so increasing taxes actually decreases this break-even level. So a $1 increase would actually lower that break-even level of real GDP. Now, that same $1 increase in tax, right? What's its impact going to be? I think in the actual problem, I told you that instead of an increase in tax, we have a decrease. So if this is the effect of an increase, if I have a decrease, it's going to make that positive, right? So if I think about here, what would the impact of that decrease in taxes be? Just using our hypothetical value. Every dollar decrease in tax will increase our real GDP by only $4. So the effect of that same dollar change in tax as that dollar change in government spending, it's going to have a lower or a smaller impact on my equilibrium or break-even level of GDP. So government spending is actually going to have an effect that is larger. And I think the way that the question was phrased, that change in GDP from government spending will be more than the change that comes from that same $1 decrease in taxes. Okay. Any questions on that before I move to the second part? So we'll revisit this idea on Monday. So what these values are going to end up being called are the multiplier effect. To give a brief description for now, every dollar increase in government spending changed real GDP by $5. Every decrease of $1 in taxes increased my GDP by only $4. That multiplier effect for taxes is always going to be lower. Okay. And that's because my numerator, they're really the same thing, but my numerator here is always less than 1. So if my numerator is smaller, that kind of multiplier effect is always going to be smaller as well.
So did the decrease in taxes, is that what took away the negative sign for MPC?
Yeah, so this is like the effect of a $1 increase in government spending or taxes. The problem said what happens if taxes go down by $1? This would be kind of the change.
Okay.
Yeah, it would just flip the sign there. Now, what if instead I'm just comparing the effect of that government spending and I say, okay, what else could change that would have the exact same impact on my real GDP? So what else would a $1 change in also lead to a factor of 5 or a $5 increase in real GDP? So I'm going to write this out again for us, just so I can draw some directional arrows here. So our break-even level or equilibrium GDP, we had autonomous consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports minus MPC times taxes over 1 minus MPC. So essentially, if I started to do this and take a derivative of everything here, other than taxes, everything is going to have that effect of 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, right? So it doesn't matter if I see that $1 in government spending, it increases real GDP by 5. If I increase investments by $1, would have the same kind of multiplier effect or derivative, increases real GDP by 5. Autonomous consumption also would increase it by that same amount. Increase in exports would also increase it by the same amount. So I don't believe any of those are actually question or potential answers in this problem, right? The only thing that we have an increase for would be an increase in disposable income, but that's not part of our equation, right? So that's kind of like a distracting answer. Now, what could also cause there to be a factor of 5 or a $5 increase in real GDP? Well, if imports go up, the actual effect on real GDP would be that it goes down, right? Because we're subtracting imports here. However, if we saw a decrease in imports, that would cause our real GDP to change by the same amount as a $1 increase in government spending. So there, to get the same change in that break-even equilibrium level of GDP, a decrease in imports of the same amount would cause the exact same change. So that's going to be what the answer is, right? A decrease in imports. Okay. Now, one of the other distracting answers that we know isn't going to be true, and we kind of already proved this to ourselves here, is what amount, right? Well, we already said if government spending goes up by $1, real GDP changes by 5. If taxes go down by $1, we're subtracting a smaller amount, GDP would only go up by 4. So even though it does cause the same directional change, it's not causing real GDP to change by the same amount. And that reason why is because essentially when we're taking a derivative, the effect of a change in any one of these things, right? Autonomous consumption, investments, government spending, net exports, a change in any one of these is going to have the impact on GDP of 1 over 1 minus PC. The change in tax, the change is going to be MPC over 1 minus MPC. Same denominator. Which of these fractions is going to be larger? Well, if this is always less than 1, this numerator would always be greater. The same $1 change in autonomous consumption, investment, government spending, expenditures, or imports would always cause my real GDP to change by more than that same $1 change in taxes. Okay. So hopefully, so a couple minutes to kind of get that submitted. So there we said the government spending effect would be greater than or more than the change in taxes. And then in order to get the same effect as that government expenditure or government spending, we would have to see of the available options a decrease in imports. Okay. Any questions before we kind of jump back into the slides here? Okay. All right. So taking a little bit of a different direction here, let's think about, we now kind of are talking about consumption. We're talking about the factors. What are some things that would impact that level of consumption? So we've got the marginal propensity to consume, we've got autonomous consumption, but what might cause a shift, right? So if we go all the way back, oops, if I can get here, there we go. We were finding that break even or that equilibrium level of GDP where actual consumption was the same as potential consumption. So what might change this actual kind of consumption, right? So we'll come down here. I can get there. There we go. So if I have increases in my population, essentially we said before, thinking about that consumption function as being representative. Well, if every consumer is, say, spending $100, if I have one consumer, that's 100, but if I have two, that's 200. So increases in population will change the overall level of consumption in our economy, right? Shift it so that it's higher. Increases in wealth. If people have more money, their disposable income is higher, they're going to be able to consume more, even if the marginal propensity to consume is exactly the same. So what could cause increases in wealth? Well, if I'm earning the same amount of money, but I have higher inflation, well, that actually lowers the real value of my income. That would lower consumption. Okay? Now, the opposite would work as well. If I had lower inflation, that increases the value of my income, which means I would increase my consumption. So a lot of these things we've already kind of mentioned in prior modules, but it's kind of revisiting them in this different model. If we said if they have higher wealth or kind of higher real income, what's another thing that could shift it? Well, if I expect to have more income. So this is one of the shifters of aggregate demand that we talked about. It's very similar because part of aggregate demand was consumption. So if I expect higher income in the future, or we said also if I have more job security, that's going to increase consumption. Right? This is the idea if you're a college student, you currently aren't earning that much, but you expect to once you're done, hopefully. And so you might spend more today expecting that you're going to be making more money in the future. People behave today based off of what they expect in the next time period. Same thing if we think about interest rates. We said for consumers, right? If I'm borrowing money, so this is the idea that autonomous consumption, if I had no income, I have to borrow money in order to spend it. So if interest rates are higher, I would actually be less likely to borrow because borrowing is more costly. So higher rates actually means that consumption is costly. I'd be more likely to save, and I would actually see a decrease in consumption. If interest rates are lower, we said borrowing is less costly. People will borrow more money, have more money available to consume. So lower rates increase consumption, similar to when we talked about aggregate demand. Higher rates decrease consumption. Taxes, we've already talked about these, kind of similar thing from the earlier module. or tax expectations. Once again, whether I have more income or whether I expect to have more income, I behave today the same way. So if taxes were higher, we said in our earlier example, even making the same amount of money, if I have to pay more in taxes, and you can think about here for consumers, a sales tax is a really good example of this. If I have to pay more in sales tax, I don't have as much money left over to buy other products. So increases in taxes or increases in tax expectations will lower our consumption, and then vice versa. So, excuse me, things that will increase consumption will basically be if I have the same level of disposable income, changes in any one of these things would still lead me to buy more, right? So even if I have the same level of disposable income, a change in any one of these factors would still having the same amount of money, I would purchase or increase the amount that I'm consuming. This is the idea of if I'm earning $100 today, but I expect to have 300 tomorrow instead of only 200 tomorrow, well, I'm going to increase my current level. Even though my level of disposable income really hasn't changed, if I expect that it's going to be higher in the future, I would spend more today. So what is this going to look like for us? There we go. So this was our model before. So we've got consumption, right, and disposable income when they're exactly the same. That was like our ideal scenario in the sense that we're consuming every single thing that we possibly, or sorry, we're spending every single dollar that we're earning, right? There's no savings, no dissavings. They're exactly the same. The actual consumption, C1 here, when we have zero savings, that will be the point where our actual consumption hits our essentially potential consumption. Well, if one of these factors change that shifts consumption, what's going to happen to our new equilibrium real GDP? It's now going to be higher. So one way to think about this is, even if I had the same level of disposable income, if all of a sudden taxes are lower, well, that same $100 before, even if I was spending all of it, but now taxes are $10, and taxes were $10. If taxes are now zero, I now don't have 90 to spend, I now have 100, right? So at every single level of disposable income, when taxes are lower, I have more available funds to spend, we would see actual consumption increase. Or any of those other factors that increase consumption, they would increase that equilibrium or break even level of GDP or consumption here. Okay. Now we know consumption is not the only thing that matters. We also had I, G, and net exports. So what impacts is investment going to have? Well, actual investment in our economy would be the planned investment plus unplanned. So unplanned, I won't kind of hype on this too much. I'd be more likely to give you the other examples we'll talk about in a second. But basically, if I all of a sudden see that I have a change in inventories, it's kind of like expected sales. So if I have a bunch of units that I'm currently not able to spend or kind of put towards my production process, but they're still there, I would expect to be able to use them in the future and sell them later on. I might increase my current level of investment, knowing that I can sell those, you know, or kind of take that inventory and kind of either sell it or use it to produce more goods in the future. So that would increase investments. Other things that would increase investments, and we'll kind of talk about the reverse of that as well. But if interest rates are higher for investors or for companies, is that a good or a bad thing? Well, if I'm making investments, higher interest rates mean the payouts are higher. So it means I'd be more likely to invest or increase my level of investment. So lower real interest rates would have the exact opposite effect, right? Lower real interest rates, I'd be earning less on my investments, so I'm less likely to invest, or I would decrease my level of investments into physical capital. If I expect to have higher profits in the future, similar to consumers, we act today as though we already have what's coming tomorrow. So if I think I'm going to have higher profits today, I might preemptively invest more into physical capital or make more investments. Sorry, if I expect future profits tomorrow, I'd be more likely to then, act as though I have that today and kind of increase my level of current investments, right? And then the reverse. If I think that my profits are going to go down, I'd be less likely to make investments or decrease my investments today. If I have improvements in technology, right, with the same amount of income, my factors of production are more effective, I would kind of be more likely to invest more as that technology increases. And then business taxes, it's a similar idea with consumers, but if instead I put taxes on companies, right, or the production of products. So I think about like the in the news right now, there's this big thing about these centers for AI, and they require a bunch of water, take a bunch of water to cool them down, and that hurts the areas they're in. Well, what might we see? We might see them start to tax, increase taxes for water consumption on these businesses. If we increase taxes, they have less available funds to invest. Higher taxes would actually decrease investment. Lower business taxes would increase investment. Right? Okay, so these are some of our investment shifters. Now, I'm going to make a change to the slide. I knew this ahead of time, but uh, I haven't changed it yet, so I will update this after class. But this picture should have been on the previous slide for consumers. So this is the idea that when interest rates were lower, people wanted to consume more. They were likely to take out more loans. What should be on this slide is the following, right? For companies, right? If interest rates are higher, so if I think about this relationship instead of investment and then kind of real interest rates, when real interest rates go up, we said I'm making more money on my investments. So actually, when I'm looking at like interest rate one, and then I'm looking at the level of investment, if that real interest rate increases, the level of investments by firms or companies should increase, right? Kind of works the exact opposite of what we should have for consumers. So I'll put a graph that looks like this onto that slide, move the other graph to the slide it was supposed to be on, which was for consumers. Okay. Any other questions on that before we keep moving? Okay.
I have one
Oh,
question. Sorry.
yep.
Um, for why the line doesn't start at zero, is that like gap between where the line
I
starts?
I was just drawing this quickly.
Oh, sorry. I was wondering if
I'm
it's like a
yeah,
y.
sorry. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? If interest rates are zero, why would I ever invest anything? Right? I have the same amount of money. So sorry, I'm just drawing this quickly.
Oh, sorry.
It should
Yeah,
be at that 0 point, yes.
that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, call me out and things like that if I ever am going too quick. All right. So just like with increases in consumption, if I see higher levels of investment, well, when we were calculating what potential GDP was, it's C plus I plus G plus net exports. So basically, if we factor in investments or higher levels of investment, that means at the same level of kind of GDP, we have more available to consume, right? So that actual consumption would now not only just include consumption from individuals, but also consumption essentially from our producers or these investments made into fiscal capital. Right? If we factor those in, what does it do to that break-even level of GDP or equilibrium level of GDP? It increases it. Okay. And then same kind of thing, if we have government expenditures or expenses, you can think about this as like we have disposable income. We're kind of adding taxes in. Taxes, what we're taking away from consumers, but we're able to be used by the government. So we could also think about if we have net exports, how will these things get factored in? Once again, we'll kind of reuse this in a second. Net exports are exports minus imports. It's really going to look not a whole lot different, right? Increases in investment or increases in government spending would both lead to higher levels of kind of equilibrium or break-even levels of real GDP. Now, the way that I drew this in here, if we add in net exports, we set that for most economies, especially the larger economies we look at, net exports tend to be negative, in which case, if net exports were ever negative, we would actually see that the actual consumption was a little bit lower. Mhm. Um, so this assumed that kind of net exports was negative here. Let me see, do I have anything here that I want to go through? No, but what I do want to do is make this point since we're at this point. Okay. So thinking about net exports here for a second. Where did my better green marker go? There it is. So I'm thinking about consumption here. kind of my disposable income, or what we ended up saying kind of was our real GDP when we look at the entire economy. So here was like the hypothetical potential expenditures are exactly equal to what our real GDP is. So this is kind of like a 45-degree line. Every dollar that we have to spend, we are spending it. Actual consumption varies from that. So the point where savings was equal to zero, or our break-even point was right here. And this would be like I'm taking consumption plus investment plus government spending. If I factor in net exports, I would then kind of add this into our actual consumption. But remember, when we're calculating actual consumption or we're calculating GDP, it was C plus I plus G plus exports, where exports were 400, imports were 500. Well, that would make my net exports negative, in which case, when I'm adding in a negative value, that would mean that every level of disposable income, we're actually seeing a lower level of consumption. So if net exports are negative, this was the idea that it would kind of be decreasing our break even or equilibrium level of GDP. Okay. Now, if instead I told you that imports are decreasing, we actually don't know exactly what's going to happen to that break even level. We know it's going to be higher than before, right? Because if I'm now subtracting a smaller value, subtracting a smaller value should increase actual consumption or that break even level of GDP. But if this went from like 500 to 450, I'd still have a negative value here. I'd be like right here. But if it decreases all the way to 300, now I get a positive net export that could actually increase it to up here, right? So this would be like if my imports went to 450, and this was like if our imports went all the way down to 300. Okay. So where exactly net exports or changes in exports or changes in imports are going to shift this, we don't really know, right? Unless we're told the actual values, right? We would need to know what the actual sign of my net exports are. Is that questions on that idea?
Is the red line just when net exports are zero?
Essentially, yeah, that's I'm just kind of using that as like our comparison point if we had no exports or imports.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. All right. So we've got what, 5 minutes left here. I think, let me see where I left off. So we kind of worked through this in Excel already today a little bit. We'll kind of come back to this at the beginning of class on Monday. We looked in Excel how the impact on real GDP of investments. We'll also compare that to taxes. And then we'll go back to, I was telling you about like the factor, right? It was like 5 versus 4 in the example I gave. We're going to call that our multiplier effect. We're going to see how that varies between consumption, investment, autonomous consumption, and then taxes. And that was kind of where we were taking derivatives. So we'll kind of revisit that idea, probably have a more complete description of it. And then we're going to think about what happens to this break-even level of GDP if we see prices adjust. Okay. So we'll kind of go through the rest of this material at the very beginning of class on Monday. I'm guessing it'll take us 20 minutes or so. I don't think it'll take too much longer. Maybe some, a little longer if we do a little bit more review. And then to kind of give you a roadmap of where we're going. I alluded to some of this at the beginning of class, but I think it's important to put out a pretty good game plan. And I'll put an announcement that kind of reminds you of all this. But that module 8 reading is due before we start class on Tuesday. That's the original due date, so I didn't want to change that, even though Monday will mostly be covering module 8. So that's the final module that'll be on the second midterm exam, which is going to be next Friday. Okay. Um, excuse me. So next week on Monday and Tuesday, we'll be going through new material, mostly from Module 8, finishing up Module 7. After class on Tuesday, I'll put up that fourth quiz. That'll be due before the exam kind of starts on Friday. I wouldn't suggest doing it on Friday, but try to get it done in advance. After Monday's class, in fact, I might even get them up over the weekend. But for sure, after Monday's class, I'll have kind of that next set of practice problems up so that you can start studying for that or practicing for that quiz four, even though it won't be released until after we're done with class on Tuesday, because we won't have gone through all the material until then. So that would leave Wednesday and Thursday for review. I will not be able to do a live class on Wednesday. So what I'm going to do, I already have some of it recorded, but I'm recording me basically doing what we would be doing for review if it was live, which is working through a lot of those practice problems, but also changing them or adding some problems in that I think would be wink, wink helpful for the exam. Okay. So I will get that posted after Tuesday's class. So you'll kind of have that review session that we would have had on Wednesday. And then Thursday's class will be as usual, will be live. Um, I'll do any problems you guys want to see worked through from either set of the practice problems. Once again, I'll get that fourth set of practice problems up by the end of the day Monday or by the end of the day Monday for sure. But like I said, I think I'll get them up over the weekend. Um, so anything you want to see worked through on those old quiz questions from quiz 3, quiz 4 won't quite be done with. Although if you have similar questions, you could kind of ask, not the exact values that we had in the quiz, but similar types of questions. I could work through those as well. Okay. So that's kind of a roadmap for where we're going. I'll mention a lot more, this next week as well, but I just wanted to kind of end the week giving us a snapshot in terms of what we're going to be doing next week. Okay. So I'm going to end the video here, but if you have any other questions after I do that, I'll kind of have this open.